Welcome everybody to another Rising Tide Foundation Sunday lecture, where we've had the pleasure of voyaging through the minds of great storytellers and literature, stretching back thousands of years into the past and into the Renaissance period. We haven't really reached the 20th century yet, and we won't still for many weeks to come. However, the theme that we've been exploring is how to really interface with universal history, which is something that you can't really do literally. Like anything, as soon as you try to express an idea in a literal, crystallized way, the essence of the idea, unfortunately, does tend to die, because the thing that brings an idea about isn't its descriptive form, its outward expression, but it's really something deeper and creative that brings a new thought into being, a conception, right? That's even the word that was used by even people like Socrates thousands of years ago, when talking about the birth of a new idea, was conception, to conceive, for a very reason. And he thought of himself as a metaphysical midwife. All good teachers, we know, tend to also tap into this power. We know that people like Helen Keller described this as the power that she had been able to tap into through a great teacher, Anne Sullivan, who, rather than assuming that she was just the outward expression of her behavior, of her senses, which were very deprived, she only had 3 of the 5, and Sullivan instead, like Socrates, recognized that there was a deeper innate soul to be kindled like a fire. And you do this through love, through compassion. And even Helen Keller talked about how her earliest discovery was the sense that there was an otherness that had love for her, first real concept, beyond even just the sense of water being an idea. There was really that deeper sense that she thought back on. Now, the thing that both Helen Keller, Anne Sullivan, Socrates, Plato, and everyone in between and beyond all tend to tap into as teachers is that they're storytellers as well, that they look for the metaphor, they look for the irony that allows for the mind to be engaged and awakened, so that you're not filling a vessel, as Aristotle had proposed, that the mind be filled or packed like an attic with things called data. And when there's too much space, you have to take away some of the stuff, some of the boxes in the attic, and make room for new stuff. But rather, again, it's a light, it's a fire that can always be heated ever more without ever coming to a boundary condition of like, okay, now I've hit my fill of knowledge and wisdom, I'm done. You can't do that with real knowledge. And real teachers and real storytellers, real artists who are really worth the name, they tap in, they understand that. So all of these different classes have been experimenting and exploring the minds of people who have had that sense and became known as great artists, great literary figures throughout the ages, and will continue to be known, I believe, for as long as there's humanity. Today, we're going to jump ahead a couple hundred years from last week's class on Rabelais, and we're going into the mind of an incredible and underestimated power of the 19th century and beyond, named James Fenimore Cooper. Cynthia has done an immense amount of work exploring the deeper history and the context, as well as the literary writings of some of the essential works by Cooper that I think will surprise all of us. So Cynthia, I won't say anything more. It's all yours.
I'm just coming over a bad flu as well. As Matt mentioned, we were both sick, so I might not be the sharpest tool in the shed today, but I will do my best. So my class is on James Fenimore Cooper's The Bravo, A Lesson in Political Intelligence. And I'm sure many people here are probably aware of James Fenimore Cooper. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are many who are not. What's interesting is that Fenimore was actually one of the most prominently read literary writers during his time. And, you know, with the German classical culture, English classical culture, names that come to mind, or Russian classical culture are Shakespeare, Schiller, and Goethe, and Pushkin. But who comes to mind for America? And funny enough, James Fenimore Cooper was, you could say, if not the level of a Shakespeare and a Pushkin, which he wasn't. He was like building the foundation towards that, and was probably one of the closest things that the United States was able to produce as a literary figure. And it was Cooper's real mission in life to be able to lay the groundwork for a Shakespeare, a Pushkin, to eventually develop in the Americas. And he understood that that was absolutely vital, because this question, which is going to be a major focus of this class, is on what are the true principles of a republic, which was Cooper's life mission, was to fight for these principles. And he fought for them, not just through his involvement in networks around political intelligence, but he very much engaged in this through the domain of cultural warfare, through his literary works. So most people are going to, if they're aware of Cooper, they'll be aware of something like The Last of the Mohicans. But he also wrote a book called The Bravo, which will be the focus later on in this class. But before we can discuss that, there's a lot of important historical components and components of Cooper's life that we need to have a comprehension of in order to understand fully what Cooper's intention was in writing the Bravo. So I think a very good quote to introduce us to the man, James Fenimore Cooper, comes from his book, The American Democrat, where he says, "Whenever the government of the United States shall break up, it will probably be in consequence of a false direction having been given to public opinion. This is the weak point of our defenses, and the part to which the enemies of the system will direct all their attacks. Opinion can be so perverted as to cause the false to seem true, the enemy a friend, and the friend an enemy, the best interests of the nation to appear insignificant, and trifles of moment, in a word, the right the wrong, and the wrong the right. In a country where opinion has sway, to seize upon it is to seize upon power. As it is a rule of humanity that the upright and well-intentioned are comparatively passive, while the designing, dishonest, and selfish are the most untiring in their efforts, the danger of public opinions getting a false direction is fourfold, since few men think for themselves." So, since this is Cooper's life's mission, the question we should be posing ourselves firstly is, well, what is a republic? And at first that might seem like there should be a pretty tight answer to that, but there isn't. It's still, you could say, a work in progress in terms of what is the formation of an ideal republic. The word coming from the Latin phrase res publica, which means public thing, and comes from when Rome first established their republic, which we'll be going into a little bit. So this question of a republic, most people agree upon its definition as something other than monarchy. That's like pretty much the first distinguishment of what is a republic. So it's against the rule of king. The concept that one is chosen as a divine right by God, that is given this right to rule over all other people. However, the concept of a republic, further than that, depending on who you're talking to, it can be a government formed from ruled by an oligarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy. And even here, aristocracy, there's more than one definition of an aristocracy too. So we'll be discussing these things. Is one form of government better than the other? Are they all equal? Is it something other than just this idea of being ruled by a small grouping an aristocratic grouping, which we'll define further later on, or this concept of democracy. Is virtue lying in any of those, types of organizations, or does virtue lie somewhere else as the source of the best government? And again, like, not a concrete form, right? But what are the principles that the best of all governments all need to uphold, no matter the form that they choose? So this is a question that I want people to keep in their minds, and we won't answer it just yet. And I mean, there isn't going to be a perfect answer anyway. It's something that we all, as citizens who are concerned with upholding justice, should constantly be thinking about ourselves and what our role is in playing into this, playing a part of that. So since Rome was the originator of the concept of republic, I think it's important to go over just a few highlights of what that consisted of. So Rome started out as a kingdom in 753 BC. It was led by 7 kings in all. And what's interesting about the system of kings is that it was never based off of the hereditary principle. And the king was someone who was voted in by a senate from the very beginning. It was only until Ancus that it started to become a little bit more of this idea of not quite a hereditary principle, but that the king was going to be a major part of choosing who was going to be his successor. So in the case of Ancus, he had chosen an adopted son, not his own sons, but an adopted son. And this adopted son, Tarquin, ended up becoming king, and he ruled for 30 so years, and he was killed in his elder years by Ancus's 2 sons. But before he was killed, it's said that he was able to choose Servius Tullius as his successor, and the Senate is agreeing with the king's selection. But you can see there's already a problem that's starting to occur in how to uphold the most upright, the most deserving in positions of leadership. So Tarquin, again, he picks an adopted son, not his own sons, and it's Servius Tullius who becomes king for another, again, 30 or so years. And he is killed in a very bloody display by sadly, Tarquin's own sons, Tarquin the elder's sons. And Servius Tullius, to make matters worse, for people who started to have this idea of inherited nobility and inherited aristocracy, was that Servius was born a slave from a slave. So when he was killed by the sons of Tarquin, it was Superbus, who here is labeled Tarquin the Proud, who took over. And he was the last of the kings, and he was the most barbaric and unruly of all of the kings. As I mentioned, he basically bought the Senate to select him as king, and was bad-mouthing Servius Tullius when he was in his 70s in the Senate. And the way the story goes, Servius comes to the Senate to defend himself, and they attack him, beat him, throw him down the stairs. And then Servius's own daughter, who is married to Superbus, runs him over by horse carriage. And the street becomes known as a Vicus Scleratus, street of shame and infamy. So Superbus ruled for 26 years, and not surprisingly, he wasn't very popular with the Roman people and the Senate. He ruled as a cruel despot, and there was a snapping point with the Roman people when Superbus's son, one of his sons, Sextus, raped a nobleman's wife named Lucretia. Lucretia it's said, was so humiliated. She felt so dishonored by this act that once she relayed it to a group of 4 high-ranking men, she stabbed herself in the heart with a dagger. Junius Brutus, who's the ancestor of Brutus that we know of from Julius Caesar, so he's the predecessor. Junius Brutus was one of the men that was present at the scene when Lucretia says what happens to her. And Livy, the historian, writes that as soon as Lucretia had committed suicide, Brutus rushed over to her, plucked the dagger out of her breast, and raised it, swearing the end of the Tarquin kingship. He was able to banish the Tarquin family. He basically gathered all of the Roman citizens together, and they voted to banish the Tarquin family. And Junius Brutus had them swear an oath that they would never suffer another man to rule Rome ever again. And as per Livy, the Roman people, desirous of liberty, would vow from that point on no longer to be swayed by the entreaties or bribes of kings. So from the, as a point that people should keep in mind, the rape of Lucretia is often credited as the reason why the Roman people rebelled and said that they would never suffer a king again. But as Machiavelli makes the point in his discourses on Livy, it was not the isolated event of Lucretia's suicide that had caused the people to rebel, but the fact that Superbus had forsaken all law and had treated all of Rome with such dishonor that Rome would have been unrecognizable after a few generations under the Tarquin rule. If Superbus had been a just king, the crime against Lucretia would have been presented to him to act as judge over, and he would not have been punished for the crime of his son. But this was not done. It was not done because it was known that Superbus had no respect for a law benefiting the general welfare of the people, but rather only knew his own personal law, and this is what the people could no longer suffer under, the arbitrary law of a king. Though many of the political institutions would remain the same when Rome became a republic, one of the major transformations of this was that in the place of a king, you would have 2 proconsuls who would be voted in by the Roman citizenry and would have a 1-year term. And this was, of course, done to try to dissuade anyone desiring to rule indefinitely and from abusing their powers for personal gain. And for it being such a short period of time, I think it also encouraged that everyone should expect that they could also possibly hold that responsibility. It's good as a citizenry that you can think that, at any point you can be handed the baton where you're possibly responsible for the people. And so you take more care, I think, in your education, if you know that that task could very easily fall upon you, that you're selected, for the task. So again, this concept of the hereditary principle was one of the corrupting influences of the period of kings. This concept that you inherit nobility, you inherit superiority regardless of your actions in this world. So unfortunately, Junius Brutus, very quickly into his proconsulship, was challenged with how just of a leader he would be. And his 2 sons were found conspiring with the exiled Tarquin family, plotting their return to the throne. And so Brutus had to act over as a judge over his sons in their treason and sentence them to death. And he had to witness their executions, which was considered the responsibility of the proconsul. So this is not to say that Brutus was a cold man, but rather that he treated his sons with no additional favor and judged their punishment for their crimes as he would have done for anyone else. It was because of this reputation for upholding honor that Brutus became a hero in Roman history, that he was not only to overthrow a tyrant king and helped establish the Republic, but that he embodied the noble qualities it was to represent, and that nobody was above the natural law, which defends the general welfare of its people. So the Roman Republic would exist from 510 BC to 227 BC. And, in its early years, this concept of liberty was really taken seriously, liberty from the arbitrary rule of another. And that liberty was considered by the Roman people the most noble of all things, and such that they respected it when they saw it in a foreign people. So Rome, in the beginning period of its republic, when it was expanding, it offered citizenship to some of the foreign states if they were considered worthy of it. And as Machiavelli recounts of the Privernati people, when they were asked, whether they would become citizens of Rome, they answered they would abide by Roman law if they were treated well under her. And instead of being punished for what could have been seen as arrogance, they were rewarded with Roman rights, since, quote, as Machiavelli writes, men who hold their liberty above everything else were worthy of being Roman citizens. And so that was the core fundamental of the Republic, that if Rome treats you well as a citizen, fairly, equally, it is the highest honor, and it's the most cherished form of liberty you could have. Unfortunately, by around the 2nd century BC, Rome started to develop core fundamental problems that would lead to extensive corruption and civil unrest. They would never fully recover from this, and it would spell the end of the Republic. And I go over that in more detail in another class I did, How to Conquer Tyranny, which I can leave in the description box to this video when it's up. So the Roman state would collapse, and it would give way to a monarchy, if not in name and form. I mean, it was an empire led by an emperor, and it was based on largely hereditary principle. And Shakespeare tells this very important story of how Rome went from a republic to an empire in his play Julius Caesar, where a people who once valued liberty above all else and vowed to never suffer the rule of a king ever again were now freely offering the crown to the power-lustful general Julius Caesar, which you see here, Mark Antony offering the crown to Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play. It's offered 3 times, and Julius Caesar's making a show that he doesn't want it, but he obviously does, and he does become emperor soon after, and the crowd is cheering for this. So the people at this point had become very small and had forgotten the liberty that they had vowed, made an oath towards under Junius Brutus, and now they wished to be ruled over. They wished to relinquish themselves of responsibility of a citizenry, and were willing to trade this in for promises of security and comfort. This compromise would unleash one of the most terrible tyrannies upon not just the Roman people, but Europe for centuries to come. And for those who are aware of the history, Mark Antony offers the crown to Julius Caesar because he himself is seeking out power and influence. And when Julius Caesar dies, Mark Antony is one of the most, terrible oppressors of the Roman people, where he actually empties the prisons of all the criminals so that he can form a massive gang to just take hostage the whole city. It's a really awful situation. So Rome would eventually be its own undoing from the rot within, and the empire would collapse, centuries later. So despite this, the concept, this Roman concept of a republic, this concept of liberty and freedom from the arbitrary rule of a few or a one, was something that inspired many Republican states afterwards, including Florence and early modern Britain, which is ironic because Britain went from a republic to a monarchy, which then tried to stop many of its colonial territories from becoming republics, especially that of the United States. So the United States was very, very aware that its organizing around the concept of a republic was Roman inspired. To the left, you see a picture of Quintus Cincinnatus, which I think I skipped over. I didn't actually explain that story. He is one of the other heroes in Roman history, considered, an example of Roman ideal, where he was selected to be a proconsul, but he was given absolute power. It was a time of crisis for the Roman state. And he used that power to get Rome out of the crisis. And then he handed back the power afterwards and restored Rome to the previous political situation once, martial law was deemed not necessary anymore, and he returned to the life of a farmer. So he's considered the ideal because, again, he wasn't tempted by absolute power. He wasn't tempted to continue his reign past a point that no longer benefited the people. And so this is very much the ideal of what George Washington and others were inspired by, and they founded a society called the Society of Cincinnati, based off of this principle. And you see the medallions in the middle. The one above is Quintus Cincinnatus taking up sword and shield to take on responsibility for saving Rome. And then the below medallion is him returning back to his plow and returning to being a farmer. And you see his sword is put to the side since it's no longer necessary. So, and to the right, you see George Washington in a Roman garb. So very clear that they're very much inspired by this concept. And, the American Revolution was fought by farmers who were not professional soldiers. And once the revolution was won, they returned to, their chosen professions. And it was considered a corruption to have, a permanent type of professionalized, force that just practiced, militant techniques. And they thought that it was important that during times of peace, people had another type of, raison d'être, really. So the Roman Republic, despite its imperfections, had served as an example to one of the greatest ideals of liberty, such that all those who named their countries a republic afterwards all wished to, in some fashion or another, form their government around this Roman concept of liberty. However, not all republics have been made equal, and some were in fact tyrannies in disguise. Striving for such an ideal also caused much tragedy, such as the French Revolution, which was an absolute disaster that was brought upon the people the tyranny of a Napoleon. He became the leader of the French Republic as first consul from 1799 to 1804, but then declared himself emperor of the French from 1804 until 1814. He lost it for a bit and then regained it for a little bit in 1815. So he wanted to rule all of Europe and likely beyond Europe as a sort of global emperor. Thus, whatever your thoughts on Napoleon may be, it was clear that he never intended to honor the governance of a republic, but always saw himself as a king, an emperor with the right to rule without question. And so this cycle repeats itself over and over again, the temptation of absolute power, and to consider yourself, a natural, that you naturally are inclined to such power, which the Republic is fundamentally against, that no person has the natural right to govern no matter what. So what was the fundamental difference between the American and the French revolutions? Obviously, that's a very loaded question, and that's not the focus of this class, but I think it's important to go over it a little bit, since it is one of the missions in Cooper's life, is this concept of upholding the proper principles of a republic. I gave a class as well on Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, which goes into this discussion a little bit further, that people can refer to. Again, I'll put that in the description box of the video. But a lot of people might think that these words are empty words, but they're actually really important, and are very much at the core of the founding principles of the United States, which were later on violated. And that was the corruption. If these principles here had been upheld, the United States wouldn't have become what it has turned into today. If someone can read the two quotes, that would be good.
Do you want me to read that?
Sure.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Declaration 1776.
I'll do the second one.
Yeah.
We, the people of the
We
United
lose contact here.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the preamble for the American Constitution in 1787.
And so, yeah, this has been a real fundamental issue for all just republics to resolve this paradox of the sacredness of the individual, the rights of the individual, but also the importance of for the promotion of the general welfare. And that this promotion of the general welfare should also be thought of in terms of the posterity, the generations and generations that will follow. So obviously, if you want to uphold the general welfare, an individual cannot be free to do whatever they wish. However, the general welfare, what is considered the best interest, should also not violate, past a certain extent, the rights of the individual. So Ben Franklin, as you can see here, this is a painting done titled "Writing the Declaration of Independence" by Jean-Léon Jérôme Ferris, and you can see who's the boss in the situation. Ben Franklin is basically the approver of any suggestion that comes up in that. And Ben Franklin would state at the close of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, in response to a question as to what form of government had been formed, he's quoted as saying, "A republic if you can keep it." And so it was understood that the upholding of any republic would ultimately be subject to the moral condition of that society. So this is one of the fundamental cores of what is going to determine the best of all republics, is the moral condition of the society, because to have the rights of the individual, you are now responsible also for the moral integrity, the role that you play in shaping the moral integrity of society. The right of sovereignty meant the responsibility to uphold its integrity. The people would no longer have a king to blame but themselves if they were to squander this new freedom. So how did France pan out itself? Because, France had a French Revolution because they were so inspired by the American Revolution. However, it did not work out the same way for them. And one of these questions is, what is to define liberty when you shape your republic around this concept of freedom and liberty? What sort of freedom are we talking about? Is it arbitrary freedom and liberty? Is it the freedom to do whatever one wishes? One of the tragedies of the French Revolution was that, unlike with the American Revolution, it became more of a class dispute, and quickly the poor blamed anyone of an upper class as being the problems to that society. They wanted equality in a much more forceful way, instead of this concept of everyone has the equal opportunity, and there's a certain fairness in the system. It doesn't make sense to have everybody with equal responsibility no matter what your actions are. And the French Revolution turned into a bit of a mob situation where they had over 40,000 executions, including of their artists and their scientists, so of their best minds, because makes sense that their best minds were the ones educated and the ones that were able to have access to that education were unfortunately the ones that were of the upper classes who had more wealth. So instead of this concept of maybe identifying that education was at one of the cores for equal opportunity, they instead attacked those who were educated. So you can see how that became a bit of a confused thing that they were fighting for. Schiller was Friedrich Schiller. And for those who don't know who he is, I'll explain in a moment. He was 30 years old when the French Revolution started in 1789, which would be called the Reign of Terror at a certain point because of the number of people who were executed. It quickly turned into chaos, and anyone representing what was considered the elite were being sentenced to death, including their scientists and their artists. The anarchy of the Jacobin terror left the people of France ultimately leaderless and allowed for the entrance of Napoleon, who envisioned himself an emperor of not only France, but all of Europe. And the Napoleonic Wars ensued and the bloodshed increased. And here you can see one of the less romantic pictures of Napoleon in his retreat from Moscow after having lost a good chunk of his army. So Friedrich Schiller, who again, I said a little bit about him at the beginning of the class. He is sort of the Shakespeare of Germany, but his memory has been under attack, so more people remember Goethe than Schiller. Schiller wrote in response to the loss of the French Revolution, how could it be that such a pregnant moment, such a moment full of opportunity failed? This great moment had found a little people, because the French Revolution also had a lot of the American patriots that were responsible for the success of the American Revolution helping them. So it was like a really big failure in that sense. Schiller identifies that the objective condition for political change was there in France, but the subjective moral condition was lacking. And therefore, Schiller said, from now on, all improvements in politics must come through the ennoblement of the individual, for which he wrote the aesthetical letters as an education on this. So Schiller realizes that education needs to become the fundamental core for a proper revolution to occur, not a revolution that is unnecessarily bloody and destructive, but one that calls for sometimes it can't be peaceful, it's true, but that you know what your goals are, and you don't make your enemies in these sorts of situations. So this question of education was very much at the core of Schiller, and this is what he did, especially with his pieces of dramatic pieces. And there's a really beautiful quote from Schiller where he says, "I know of only one secret to guarding man against depravity, and that is to arm his heart against weakness." And for Schiller, this was done in the most natural way, not in a lecturing fashion, through drama. And no surprise, James Fenimore Cooper was very much in agreement with this. Here, there's a quote from him. Actually, someone wants to read it.
I think you have to volunteer someone.
Oh, well, I can't do that because I don't know. Okay.
Poor Schiller. In my eyes, he is the German genius of the age. Goethe has got around him one of those facetious reputations that depend as much on being a coddled celebrity. For you must know there is a fashion in this thing that is quite independent of merit, while Schiller's fame rests solely on its naked merits. My life for it, that it lasts the longest and will burn brightest in the end. The schools and a prevalent taste and the caprice of fashion can make Goethes in dozens. At any time, but God only can create such men as Schiller.
So a little bit harsh from Cooper, but Schiller did have the capability of actually causing people to reflect to such a point that they were willing to transform. And that's the really beautiful thing about drama, when we're so moved by another's acts of nobility or sacrifice, of valor, of virtue, that we want to replicate that in our own world. And we are disgusted when we see, the worst types of violations occur in drama. And thus we should be equally disgusted by those things when we confront them in reality, in our society, our everyday society. These things are naturally within us, so we can uphold them, and not just, in our dreams. So Cooper recognized that the ultimate destroyer of nations and cultures was not, in fact, by evil leaders that this was accomplished, but by wrong or false beliefs adopted as popular opinion by that nation's population. Should false beliefs hold sway, the population would set itself upon the path of its own destruction. So though you can have tyrants, you can have despots, and true, they can cause a lot of destruction, it is ultimately the citizenry that has to, go along with that to a certain point, that will allow for such a society to continue to reign over its people unjustly. And again, we're going to see that being talked about in the Bravo. So Cooper would become the most well-known writer during for a certain period of his life, and very much the focal point of his writing was as a literary antagonist to monarchy, the ideas of the hereditary principle through aristocracy, inherited nobility, and feudalism. And he championed the principles of the Republic. Oh, it's not working. So Cooper would say, books are in a great measure the instruments of controlling the opinions of a nation like ours. They are an engine alike powerful to save or destroy. So again, this question of like the quality of your art is going to form the quality of your people. So it's very serious. It's not just for light entertainment. The way that we use it today, it's what cultivates our natural tastes, our natural instincts, so that we don't feel like we're at odds all the time, which I think many people feel today, of being their best that they could be, of upholding the best, upholding just the general good. It shouldn't be so difficult or challenging for people, really. We should all want this. We naturally want it. So what's going on? Why is it that we have so many societies where it becomes the opposite impulse? One thing that we should know is where Cooper comes from. So he was very much born into political intelligence. His father is William Cooper, who worked closely with George Washington in the Continental Army. And after the war, Washington had directed William Cooper to move to upstate New York to establish frontier settlements of patriotic Americans. This was partially to thwart the threat of British-controlled Canada, where there was always the threat that British-controlled Canada would try to reimpose its colonial rule upon the Americans, because they had troops, stationed in Canada. So you had to have a strong settlement nearby to meet that. Of course, also industry was a focal point of towns like Coopertown. Two of William Cooper's close friends were John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, among the writers of the Federalist Papers. And John Jay's son, Peter, was close friends with James Fenimore. They were lifelong friends. And they were both second-generation leaders of the American Republic. So, the first generation, John Jay, Hamilton, Ben Franklin, all of the big hitters, James Fenimore Cooper became a real leader of the second generation of this founding father generation. So one of the interesting points is that Hamilton, who was George Washington's second in command during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton also acted as William Cooper's lawyer, defending him against the British land companies who were trying to steal millions of acres of forest land in upper New York State. And interestingly enough, the lawyer for the British was Aaron Burr during these disputes. William Cooper also served in Congress. In 1809, he was murdered by associates of Aaron Burr, just 5 years after Aaron Burr himself had murdered Alexander Hamilton in a duel, according to the historian Patrick Reckert's paper titled "The Fight for the Republic, James Fenimore Cooper and the Society of the Cincinnati." What's very interesting is, if you look at Wikipedia, they say that there's no evidence that William Cooper was murdered at all, and that it's a rumor that was started by the Cooper family, apparently, where they said that he was killed by a blow to the head during an argument with a political opponent at a public meeting in Albany, New York on December 22nd, 1809. According to Wikipedia entries, they say there's no evidence to this, and that historians have considered it to be implausible. By the way, William Cooper was also a judge. People should know. So as for the whole Aaron Burr controversy and all that, if people are not aware of that, they should look it up under some of Matthew Arrett's papers, which I guess I can link as well in the description box to this video if I remember. So the Society of Cincinnati, again, based off of Quintus Cincinnatus, was founded in May 1783 by three primary figures: Baron von Steuben, Washington, and Hamilton. And later on, quickly later on. They would set up a headquarters in France as well with Marquis de Lafayette for the European branch of the society, which was in connection with German Republican forces and so forth. So James Fenimore Cooper's dad was also a part of the Society of Cincinnati, and James Fenimore Cooper would become a leading member of the society. And they had been formed partially to, protect the United States, because there was always the danger of a British reconquest after they had won the war, because the British troops had stayed in the United States for a while. But it was also to keep the principles of the Republic taught. So, the 13 states, it's a very new formed institution. These kind of acted as, you could say, mini think tanks in these areas to uphold this form of government in the best way possible. And it was also used in Europe to help facilitate support for the Republican movements. So it was very much a good intelligence operation. Why isn't this working? So despite the failure of the French Revolution, there was still a lot of inspiration in Europe for the Republican ideas. And James Fenimore Cooper was appointed as the American consul to the Cincinnati Society in Lyon, France. And so he worked very closely with the Lafayette circles. And for people who don't know, Marquis Lafayette, he came from France to help fight in the American Revolution. And he made a bit of a name for himself. And he also comes from somewhat aristocratic circles. So they also found it useful for political organizing, because, Marquis Lafayette was a big fan of the Republic, so much that he named his son George Washington Lafayette. But as we'll see, he's a bit of a tragic character. I would go over the significance of this painting, but we don't really have a lot of time. All to say is that he has two sides that are pulling him in this painting, two destinies, one of monarchy and one of Republican support. So,
Cynthia?
Yes.
Just quickly, Larry just wrote saying he can't hear the last few minutes, and can you repeat? I think it's Larry, the issue on your side. Can other people hear what Cynthia is saying pretty well? I can hear just fine.
Yeah, I can hear good.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
I can
So
hear
Larry,
perfect.
it's on your end.
I'm clear.
Okay.
I
thanks.
can hear you good as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Okay, Cynthia, it's all yours. Sorry.
Okay. So another thing that people need to be aware of is that the Congress of Vienna assembled in 1814-15, and it was assembled to reorganize Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. So again, the amount of destruction that the failed French Revolution laid out for all of Europe was quite extensive. So after the disaster of the Napoleonic Wars, you have the Congress of Vienna, and they basically want to divvy up Europe very much with the focus of a balance of power amongst four primary empires, that being Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Here you only see to the left Russia, Austria, and Prussia, because Britain, typically British, they take a step back. They like to remain in the shadows of these types of big events. And so it was these three empires to the left that would form the Holy Alliance. And the way that these territories were being divvied up, it was disregarding any concept of nationality. So again, there's all these Republican movements happening during this period that they're arbitrarily dividing these territories to just be parts of an empire. And so this caused a lot of problems up until the point of even World War I with the Versailles Treaty. It was such an unnatural way of dividing up these parts. And it was clearly a way to mess up the Republican movements that were being attempted. The Holy Alliance as well, the monarchist powers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia also formed with the very clear intention to prevent revolutionary forces in Europe, otherwise being Republican. And they were namely against replacing monarchies with republics. So by 1815, despite this disaster of the Congress of Vienna being celebrated, the Americans defeat the British in the War of 1812, and it creates a sort of resurgence for the Republican ideals in Europe. And there's aggressive intervention, and largely coming from the intelligence circles around the American revolutionary forces, and also those who helped fight in the American Revolution, such as many high-level French and German players. So they're now trying to organize Europe. France is still, despite all of the problems, considered to be the first one, the most likely one to turn to being a republic, which is going to kind of cause a domino effect for many other countries to quickly follow. And Marquis de Lafayette is very much at the head of all this. And Cooper, again, he's also stationed in France to help this come about. During this time as well, you have Schiller working for pro-Republican ideas. You have the von Stein-Humboldt educational reforms of 1809 to 1813 that are also occurring. And it's so clear that they want to undo this, that they even formed the Carlsbad Decrees, a series of measures adopted by the German Confederation in 1819 to establish severe limitations on academic and press freedoms, and set up a federal commission to investigate all signs of political unrest, which basically means Republican ideas in the German states. So that's when the Humboldt educational reforms started to become attacked in Germany and other places in Europe. And many of these people ended up leaving Europe and going to the United States. So the United States was actually getting a real cultural upshift by the fact that a lot of these people were leaving, although it wasn't really helping out the European situation that they were leaving. So Cooper is very much in the middle of this cultural warfare, this fight for proper education towards proper cultural ideals that can then qualify themselves to be upholders of the principles of a fair and just republic. And so there's this quote from Samuel Morse. I don't think it's necessary to read it, but just basically saying, when you travel in Europe, you see Cooper's books, in the front of almost every bookstore as soon as they're published. And they're in 34 different places in Europe with every new publication that he's doing. So by 1824, Cooper's second novel, The Spy, is published in Germany. Cooper is really popular in Germany amongst many other countries, and is at this point that he shortly after became the most widely read author in the world. And his works were translated into French, German, Italian, Spanish, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, Persian, and more. So it's interesting. He wrote over 40 novels, innumerable essays and letters, and an important handful of nonfiction works. It's interesting that so many people, especially Americans, don't really know very much about Cooper. Whereas, if you talk to any British person or Russian person, they certainly know their Shakespeare or their Pushkin, like actually have read and studied Shakespeare and Pushkin. Germany as well, unfortunately, has lost a lot of memory of Schiller. So why did that happen? That's also an important question to ask. How is it that the most widely read writer during a certain period in the world, like the United States, doesn't even have a memory that they produced this guy? So as I was saying, everything was resting upon the shoulders of Marquis Lafayette to set up this republic. And when the time comes where everything is ripe for this to happen, he ends up supporting Louis Philippe as king instead of establishing a republic. And, you know, it's said that he and Louis Philippe go out onto the balcony to greet all of the people who are like calling for a republic and for Lafayette to be the first president of, you know, their republic. Lafayette declares, "Here's the king we needed. It's the best of republics." And he hugs Louis Philippe. There's a story behind this that I don't have enough time to go into, but all to say is that Lafayette was always being torn between this kind of romantic idea of monarchy and aristocracy, him also having been born from aristocracy, and this idea of what is, you know, a form of government that is best suited for upholding the general welfare of all in the most natural and humane way. So Cooper was in Germany when this happened, and he recognized at once that Lafayette had made a horrendous error in allowing Louis Philippe to be made king rather than establishing an American modeled republic on the spot. Though Cooper tried to salvage the situation, by December, Lafayette, who was promised that he was going to have, you know, a certain amount of, you know, responsibility in this new government under Louis Philippe, was quickly ousted. So he was like, it was a total embarrassment, you know, that Lafayette had supported this. Like, there was never any intention to honor any of the promises that they were making Lafayette. So within a few months, Lafayette is completely ousted, and the oligarchy's power is reestablished through the duplicity of Louis Philippe. In a letter to Peter J., John Jay's son, Cooper writes of the lost opportunity, quote, "For a few days, the old veteran, that is Lafayette, held the fate of France in his single hand," and dropped it. So yeah, I think this is an important quote. Matt, do you want to read the quote?
Okay. "It is certain that the revolution here is regarded with a very evil eye by the English aristocracy. I have just had a visit from 2 Italians. They tell me to expect important events from that quarter. At Rome, there is great discontent, and all of Upper Italy is ready for revolt. Can Austria be neutral in such a state of things? It is true discontent pervades the Tyrol, Hungary, and Bohemia. Saxony is far from satisfied. Poland feels still like a nation. Half the small German states are tired of their oppressors, and in short, there is everywhere a tendency to revolt. In fine, there is need to remodel Europe, to give Italy a national character, to secure civil rights in Germany, and to break down 100 useless and troublesome barriers which now exist, to bring people under the same government who have common interests and sympathies. Our agents complain there, as they do everywhere else, of the English influence being used against us. Of this fact, be assured, there is not a shadow of a doubt. As a nation, and often as individuals, they do us all the harm they can." James Fenimore Cooper, letter to Peter J., 1830.
So I think that's pretty straightforward. So despite large failures around the whole French situation and the European situation in general, Cooper was one of the founders of the American Bible Society in 1816. And among the missionaries sponsored by the American Bible Society were those who went to Hawaii and later became a decisive influence on Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of the First Republic, well, the Republic of China in 1911. So major success on that side of things. So unfortunately, though, by 1813, many of the Republican revolts were being crushed in country after country in Europe. That year, the fall of that year, Cooper returns to, does he return? At that point, he knows that there's not much that he can do in Europe, and he returns to the United States after about 7 years of being abroad. And he's very shocked to see how much the situation has even deteriorated in the United States itself. Because at this point, almost all of the first generation of the people who made up the founding father legacy, I guess you can say, of the United States, they either had been killed in the case of Hamilton and some others, or they had died from old age. And there was very quickly a wave that was trying to undo a lot of this work towards the Republican principles, and again return to a sort of oligarchical rule. And again, the British had still a lot of their tentacles in this, but there is also, Americans that were for that sort of system as well. As Matt is the author of The Clash of the Two Americas, will explain to people who are not familiar with the fact that the United States had two identities. So when Cooper returned, among the serious problems were the British-directed South Carolina secession movement. President Andrew Jackson was destroying the dirigist economic system of the country. One of the reasons why Alexander Hamilton was murdered, so that could happen, and refusing to defend American institutions abroad. Cooper, arriving in the United States, was shocked at what he saw. And also what was becoming clear is that because Cooper was the most widely read writer in the world, the American press was starting to attack him, and also European press, but the American press was repeating these and also offering up their own stink about the whole thing. And there were vicious things printed, like of Cooper's work. It is a mass of husks and garbage and has disgraced the country, one wrote. A review of a commentary written by Sir Walter Scott, who was a sort of opponent of Cooper in the Cultural Warfare. His son-in-law, Walter Scott's son-in-law, wrote, Lockhart showed potent causticity in exposing the gangrene of Cooper's mind in its most foul and diseased state, end quote. And name-calling was not enough. Cooper was lied about, misquoted, and distorted in the papers. So Cooper went on a counterattack and made a series of libel suits numbering in the dozens, and he won, it seems, every case, even putting some of the newspapers out of business. So it got to be such a big thing that it was known as Cooper's War Against the Press. And some of the quotes that Cooper has on this, he says, "So far as my means allow, insult shall be avenged by law, violence repelled by a strong hand, falsehood put to shame by truth, and sophistry exposed by reason." Cooper was determined, he said, to bring the press again under subjection of the law. When one considers the characters, talents, and motives and consistency of those who contrive it as a body, he is lost in wonder that any community should have so long submitted to a tyranny so low and vulgar. When it is rebuked thoroughly, it may again become useful. As the press of this country now exists, it would seem to be expressly devised by the great agent of mischief to depress and destroy all that is good and to elevate and advance all that is evil in the nation. Newspapermen are the funguses of letters who flourish on the dunghill of the common mind. The press is equally capable of being made the instrument of elevating man to the highest point of which his faculties admit, or of depressing him to the lowest. So it is at this point that we can finally get into the Bravo and try to make this efficient as possible. So Cooper had concluded that he believed that the actual monarchy system of Europe was dead. Only a semblance of it remained. And what dominated Europe was a financial oligarchy determined to maintain its feudal order against the American-led Republican movement. It was this activity and study which led Cooper to write his 3 novels placed in European settings, to which the Bravo is one of them, and which will be the one that we focus on today. So in this, Cooper focuses on the irrational, lawless character of the oligarchical mind and his ability to vividly portray the struggle between oligarchy and republicanism. He wrote the Bravo in 1830. And just as a quick note, the Bravo focuses on Venice. And Venice, as we will see, calls itself a republic. But as we investigate what kind of a republic Venice is, we'll quickly realize that it is very different from what you might expect a republic should consist of. And Venice was a very, very powerful empire, in fact. It's interesting that Shakespeare and Schiller also made studies of Venice in their works, which I have shown here, and Cooper, the leading literary figure of America, also chose to make a study on Venice. So there is something about Venice. So at the very beginning of the Bravo, Cooper makes some of his thoughts known in terms of his intention for writing this. I'll read this, but eventually I will call on someone to do some of the reading, because I do want to go through some of the story. It is to be regretted the world does not discriminate more justly in its use of political terms. Governments are usually called either monarchies or republics. The former embraces equally those institutions in which the sovereign is worshipped as a god, and those in which he performs the humble office of a mannequin. In the latter, we find aristocracies and democracies blended in the same generic appellation. The consequence of a generalization so wide is an utter confusion on the subject of the polity of states. Were we to characterize a republic, we should say it was a state in which power, both theoretically and practically, is derived from the nation, I think that's supposed to say, with a constant responsibility of the agents of the public to the people, a responsibility that is neither to be evaded nor denied. That such a system is better and large than on a small is better on a large than on a small scale, though contrary to brilliant theories which have been written to uphold different institutions, must be evident on the smallest reflection, since the danger of all popular governments is from popular mistakes, and a people of diversified interests and extended territorial possession are much less likely to be the subjects of sinister passions than the inhabitants of a single town or county. If to this definition we should add as an infallible test of the genius that a true republic is a government of which all others are jealous and vituperative, on the instinct of self-preservation, we believe there would be no mistaking the class. How far Venice would have been obnoxious proof, the reader is left to judge for himself. So the primary points he's making here are, well, what is going to be defining a republic? This question of, can you have a republic ruled by an oligarchy, an aristocracy based on inherited merit, or even that of a democracy, which, some people believe democracy more akin to something like a mob rule. So you can see that all of these sort of have problems in of themselves. And again, this question of popular opinion, because you don't want a secret government. You want your people to have some role and to have some voice in giving feedback as to whether the system is just or not. You shouldn't just rely on the judgment of a small grouping to always decide what is best without them hearing, at least considering, what are the thoughts of others. But how do we enable it such that popular opinion doesn't become the actual corrupter? So it can be used to actually intervene on corruption, or it can be the very corrupting force itself. So all of these things to keep in mind. If anyone has questions, by the way, feel free to ask, because I know it's a lot of information I'm going through. Okay, so before we go further on the Bravo, a few words on Venice. So you can see here that Venice is located up here. And you can see from the picture to the right that it's actually an island. It's supposed to be in a marsh, swamp-like area. So you can have ships that go through it, but it was apparently very difficult to access. So it offered them a lot of protection from any kind of military invasion. And they didn't have to focus too much on organizing a large army for themselves because of the geographical sort of location that they were in. And other areas that are going to be important for people to know about in our story is the Naples region, which is down here. Saint Agata, which is going to be one of the things talked about, is a part of the Naples region. And then you have Rome here, Vatican City, and you have Florence here. And people should be aware that at the time, Venice wasn't getting along with, Venice never got along with Florence, and Venice was also very much not getting along with Rome and the church states. And Naples is under the church states. So there's like opposing territories, you can say, with how this is made. So Venice, for a long time, had its influence. It was founded in 700 AD, very much from the immigration of leading Roman families from the Western Empire's collapse. And they became a center of intelligence gathering. That was really their biggest, along with their control over the banking system. It was their ability to utilize intelligence that gave them so much power that they very much dictated a lot to do with the wars that were occurring in Europe over this period, and also a lot of the politics and the policies, which some of that we will be going over. So Venice was a very powerful banking center of Europe. The Venetian bankers, also called Lombards, began to loot many parts of Europe with usurious loans of 120 to 180% interest. The oligarchical families in Venice would become extremely rich off this system and stored much of their family fortune, called the Fondo, within the Basilica of St. Mark, which functioned like a Venetian state treasury and would absorb the family fortunes of nobles who died without heirs. And that was something that Venice was very good at, having plenty of, nobles dying without heirs. And it was common that these nobles would die of mysterious circumstances or just simply disappear, and they were assumed dead, but the body never found. The canals of Venice were well known for being full of such bodies, which is the murky water kept hidden for the most part, except where the fishermen fished. So before we get into the characters and the more fun part, Cooper goes through some lengths to explain to us the system of Venice that they were under. So there's going to be a few slides where we will read this. Matt, do you want to read those slides actually?
If you'd like me to.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. It may be well to explain here to the reader some of the peculiar machinery on the state in the country of which we write, and which is connected with the scene that is about to follow. For the name of a republic, a word which, if it means anything, strictly implies the representation and supremacy of the general interests, but which has so frequently been prostituted to the protection and monopolies of privileged classes. In an age when rulers were profane enough to assert, and the ruled weak enough to allow, that the right of a man to govern his fellows was a direct gift from God, a departure from the bold and selfish principle, though it were only in profession, was thought sufficient to give a character of freedom and common sense to the polity of a nation. This belief is not without some justification, since it establishes, in theory at least, the foundations of government on a basis sufficiently different from that which supposes all power to be the property of one, and that one to be the representative of the faultless and omnipotent ruler of the universe.
We're just going to go ahead. If anyone has any questions, or even Matt, if you find anything is unclear and needs to be explained further, we'll do that. Otherwise, I'll talk about it after we read the full explanation from him.
Okay. It is probable that when the patricians of St. Mark created a community of political rights in their own body, they believed their state had done all that was necessary to merit the high and generous title it assumed. They had innovated on a generally received principle, and they cannot claim the distinction of being either the first or the last, who have imagined that to take the incipient steps in political improvement is at once to reach the goal of perfection. Venice had no doctrine of divine right, and as her prince was little more than a pageant, she boldly laid claim to be called a republic. She believed that a representation of the most prominent and brilliant interests in society was the paramount objective of government, and, faithful to the seductive but dangerous error, she mistook the last collective power for the social happiness. Collective power for social happiness. It may be taken as a governing principle in all civil relations that the strong will grow stronger, and the feeble more weak, until the first become unfit to rule or the last unable to endure. In this important truth is contained the secret of the downfall of all those states which have crumbled beneath the weight of their own abuses. It teaches the necessity of widening the foundations of society until the base shall have a breadth capable of securing the just representation of very interest, without which the societal machine is liable to interruption from its own movement, and eventually to destruction from its own excesses. Venice, though ambitious and tenacious of the name of a republic, was in truth a narrow, a vulgar, and an exceedingly heartless oligarchy. An aristocracy must ever want the high personal feeling which often tempers despotism by the qualities of the chief, or the generous and human impulses of a popular rule. It partakes, and it always has partaken, though necessarily tempered by circumstances and the opinions of different ages, of the selfishness of all corporations, in which the responsibility of the individual, while his acts are professedly submitted to the temporizing expedients of a collective interest, is lost in the subdivision of numbers. At the period of which we write, Italy had several of these self-styled commonwealths, in not one of which, however, was there ever a fair and just confiding of power to the body of the people. though perhaps there is not one that had not been cited sooner or later in proof of the inability of many to govern himself. In order to demonstrate the fallacy of the reasoning, which is so fond of predicting the downfall of our own liberal system, supported by examples drawn from the transatlantic states of the Middle Ages, it is necessary only to recount here a little in detail the forms in which power was obtained and exercised in the most important of them all.
And before we go on, I want to just say, so in this lecture, when we've been talking about aristocracy, it really is this concept that you inherit nobility. You're of the noble class, and as the fact that you're born into the noble class means that you get all of these advantages, and that others will not, and they can never partake in those advantages in society, including leadership and responsibility, because they were not born into the role. So that's the kind of aristocracy that Cooper is intervening on. Cooper was in support of a meritocratic system, which is a society where people gain responsibility through their own merit. You prove that you are capable of having such responsibility, and you qualify yourself for that. So aristocracy, in its true definition, which sometimes some of the better philosophers will bring it up, meaning ruled by the best, and that's really a meritocratic kind of idea of a system, and not that you can't necessarily have any sort of inheritance in such a system like that, but that it really is ultimately on the basis of merit that you advance in such a society. Go, Matt.
Okay, yep. Distinctions in rank, as separated entirely from the will of the nation, formed the basis of Venetian polity. Authority, though divided, was not less a birthright than in those governments in which it was openly avowed to be a dispensation of Providence. The patrician order had its high and exclusive privileges, which were guarded and maintained with a most selfish and engrossing spirit. He who was not born to govern had little hope of ever entering into the possession of his natural rights, while he who was, by the intervention of chance, might wield a power of the most fearful and despotic character. At a certain age, all senatorial rank, for by a specious fallacy, nobility did not take its usual appellations, were admitted into the councils of the nation.
And just quickly, what he means by that senatorial rank is that if you were born a noble, if you were an aristocrat, you automatically qualified to be a senator. So only the nobility could be senators, and they automatically were, whether they liked it or not.
The names of the leading families were inscribed in a register, which was entitled the Golden Book, and he who enjoyed the envied distinction of having an ancestry thus enrolled could, with a few exceptions, such as that named in the case of Don Camilo, present himself in the Senate and lay claim to the honors of the horned bonnet. I guess that's the Doge?
Yeah.
Okay. Neither our limits nor our object will permit a digression of sufficient length to point out the whole of the leading features of a system so vicious, and which was perhaps only rendered tolerable to those it governed by the extraneous contributions of captured and subsidiary provinces, which in truth, as in all cases of metropolitan rule, the oppressed weighed most grievously. The reader will at once see that the very reason why the despotism of the self-styled republic was tolerable to its citizens was but another cause of its eventual destruction.
Don Camilo is going to be one of the characters that I will talk about in the story. So again, he's talking about, like, Venice at this point is sort of already in a collapsing state, and those who are governing it are even partially aware of this, and that one of the ways that they they were able to continue for as long as they did was that they were in constant wars, and they were taking over provinces, and they were looting and plundering those provinces. As most cases of empire, that becomes what you are reliant on when you're in a collapsing state. It's one of the few things. And then other than that, it was the very corrupt banking system, for which you have, like, you know, the Merchant of Venice that Shakespeare wrote to as part of a description of that problem of usury.
As the Senate became too numerous to conduct with sufficient secrecy and dispatch, the affairs of a state that pursued a policy alike tortuous and complicated, the most general of its important interests were entrusted to a council composed of 300 of its members. In order to avoid the publicity and delay of a body large enough as this, a second selection was made, which was known as the Council of 10, and to which much of the executive power that aristocratical jealousy withheld from the titular chief of the state was confided. So, okay, so when he says that, he just means the Council of 10 held the executive power that the Doge at the top did not have access to, is what he's saying when he says the titular chief of the state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
All right. To the point, the political economy of the Venetian Republic, however faulty, had at least some merit for simplicity and frankness. The ostensible agents of the administration were known, and though all real responsibility to the nation was lost, in the superior influence and narrow policy of the patricians, the rulers could not entirely escape from the odium that public opinion might attach to their unjust and illegal proceedings. But a state whose prosperity was chiefly founded on the contribution and support of dependents, and whose existence was equally menaced by its own false principles, and by the growth of other and neighboring powers, had need of a still more efficient body, in the absence of that executive which its own republican pretensions denied to Venice. A political inquisition, which came in time to be one of the most fearful engines of policy ever known, was the consequence.
Police.
Police, sorry. An authority as irresponsible as it was absolute was periodically candied to another and still smaller body, which met and exercised its despotic power and secret functions under the name of the Council of 3.
Mm-hmm. And again, to keep in mind, so, you know, we have the Council of 300, we have the Council of 10, the Council of 3, and the Doge. And all of this is supposed to be forms of election, right? Even the Doge is elected to his station, although it is very much pageantry, as Cooper says, a mannequin king, so to speak, with no real power, very much how presidents of republics function nowadays, unfortunately. But there's very much this kind of mimicry of the form of a Roman republic. But as we will see, there's something that completely violates any concept that just because these things are so-called elections, that they must be thus fair, and not a usurpation of power.
Cynthia, when you say that there was these elections for the Council of 3 and 10, and
Well, he's going to explain. He's going to explain the Council of 3, how they're selected.
Oh, okay. But it's not the people outside of the Senate, right, who vote.
No,
Okay.
It's still amongst the aristocracy.
Okay. The choice of these temporary rulers was decidedly by lot, and in a manner that prevented the result from being known to any but their own number, and to a few of the most confidential of the more permanent officers of the government. Thus there existed at all times in the heart of Venice a mysterious and despotic power that was wielded by men who moved from society unknown and apparently surrounded by all the ordinary charities of life, but which in truth was influenced by a set of political maxims that were perhaps as ruthless, as tyrannic, and as selfish as ever were invented by the evil ingenuity of man.
Okay, just pause for a second there.
Mhm.
So, you know, again, everyone's being voted in, but by the Senate. But again, like the Senate are those who are born into the aristocracy. So if you have like a system that is decaying and becoming ever more corrupt, you can see how, you know, the Senate, which is not being voted in by anything, they're being born into the position of a senator. And this is what's supposed to be upholding, you know, the justice and the fairness of the appointments that follow afterwards. It's a very flawed system. And then when it comes to the Council of Three, they're apparently not elected, and they're chosen by chance. And their names are drawn by a lot that only they are aware of it. And interestingly, as Cooper says, a few of the most confidential of the more permanent officers of the government. So it goes to show that even the Council of Three, and they work in secret and everything, there's something even higher than the Council of Three, the permanent officers of the government. Well, what is that? Interesting. And they're the only other people who know the identities of the Council of Three other than the Council of Three. I don't think even the Doge is possibly aware of the Council of Three. Maybe. I'm not sure. So the highest office of power is a completely secretive one. And that is also one of the major problems of why such a system can't uphold itself, even if it wanted to, because it will be.
Cynthia, did you just say that the Doge is not part of the Council of Three?
Oh, he's not. No.
Huh.
Yeah. He rules like always, like he's elected, and then he rules, it seems, for life, but he's appointed that he doesn't inherit that position. But it's the Council of Three that really holds power. And as Cooper, you know, showcases in the Bravo, the Doge always has to like look to someone asking for permission whenever he's in a position where he might go off script. So he's really not in any position of power, and he's aware of it as well.
Wow. It was, in short, a power that could only be entrusted without abuse to an infallible virtue and infinite intelligence, suing the terms in a sense limited by human means. And yet it was here confided to men, whose title was founded on the double accident of birth and the colors of balls. I guess that's a reference to the lot.
Yeah.
Okay. And the colors of balls, and by whom it was wielded without even the check of publicity.
So yeah, he's making the point that this power, this absolute power that's given to the Council of Three, and they're temporary rulers, so it's still kind of following the form of a Roman republic, right? No one is selected to rule forever. The Doge is elected, and he himself, his powers are very restricted by the councils. So isn't this a fair system made of by the people? And Cooper says that only, you know, an infallible virtue, a virtue that cannot err, thus it's not human, of infinite intelligence, infinite wisdom, could, you know, use this power in a responsible manner. But, you know, anyone of a human means, this would, you know, be a disaster for. And that on top of that, the people who are selected for this power win it by double chance, or as Cooper says, double accident of birth and then lottery. Like, what a horrible system. Anyway, continue, Matt.
The Council of Three met in secret and ordinarily issued its decrees without communicating with any other body, and had them enforced with a fearfulness of mystery and a suddenness of execution that resembled the blow of fate. The Doge himself was not superior to its authority, nor protected from its decision. There is still in existence a long list of the state maxims which this secret tribunal recognized as its rule of conduct. And it is not saying too much to affirm that they set at defiance every other consideration but expediency, all the recognized laws of God, and every principle of justice which is esteemed among men.
So just to be clear, expediency means the quality of being convenient and practical despite possibly being improper or immoral. It's a sort of convenience. So this is what really ruled the state of Venice, was expediency and not the laws of God, as he says, the principle.
Pragmatism.
Yes,
Pragmatism.
yes. And you can see that the Venetian system is very much what we call a form of deep state, which is that you have this secret power that even lower levels of the council are not aware of the identities of the people who hold the positions of the highest power in such a system. So how do you hold account this council of three during their term? You cannot. You can't even hold them accountable after their term is over because you didn't know who they were. Okay, I think this is the last slide, and then.
But wait, I have a question.
Sure.
But what prevents somebody to claim that they are one of the three and when they are not?
Well, because there are because the Council of Three knows who are the three, and certain of the more permanent members of the Venetian society, which Cooper references, but he doesn't say any more about what that is. Yeah, and if you were to do something like that, you would be dealt with, because it would be known that you were trying to violate the system, which they're very protective over. So even if you're born an aristocrat, no one is above the actual system of the Venetian system in place. Everybody is considered expendable to that system. Matt?
It appears to be an unavoidable general consequence that abuses should follow when power is exercised by a permanent and irresponsible body from whom there is not appeal. When this power is secretly exercised, the abuses become still more grave. It is also worthy of remark that in the nations which submit or have submitted to these undue and dangerous influences, the pretensions to justice and generosity are of the most exaggerated character. For while the fearless democrat vents his personal complaints aloud, and the voice of the subject of professed despotism is smothered entirely, necessity itself dictates to the oligarchist the policy of seemliness as one of the conditions of his own safety. Thus Venice prided herself on the justice of Saint Mark, and few states maintained a greater show or put forth a more lofty claim to the possession of the sacred quality than that whose real maxims of government were veiled in a mystery that even the loose morality of the age exacted.
So, yeah, Venice was very much, in praise of its own loftiness and its high upholding of morality and so forth, while at the same time, saying that expediency was its principled interest. So some things that people should be aware of, the picture to the left is the mouth of the lion, and anyone who wanted to do a secret denunciation of another person could write their message and put it into the mouth of the statue, and it would be read by the Council of Three. And so this was a way for them to also gather intelligence. It was a way for people to self-police. So you couldn't trust anyone, being a citizen of Venice. And the level of secrecy, which, Cooper makes the point that what the government has as a standard for itself is going to be what largely influences the bulk of your citizenry or your people. And so because the government was so secretive, it's no surprise that the people really upheld the right to secrecy. So they actually thought of it as a right, and it was common for people to walk around with masks over their face if they wished for their identities to be, withheld from whatever action that they were involved in. So the sense of individual identity of the oligarch is entirely located in the social structure of the oligarchy itself. Universal principles or law neither define the individual's self-conception nor even any internally defined purpose. It's all about just upholding this oligarchical structure. Thus, for the oligarch, since there is no universal or higher purpose to their individual life, no obligation to principles, law, or justice, nothing, no matter how bestial or obscene, is forbidden. Masks worn by the Venetians to disguise the perpetrator, while the act is permitted and condoned. So, what a hypocrisy. And this is one of the things about the bravo, which is another word for assassin, is that, as we're going to meet who the bravo is, Jacopo, everyone is horrified, whenever they see the bravo walking down the streets, because it's supposed to be a very, villainous, immoral, like people view him as like someone who's condemned. And yet them having this sort of judgment of the bravo, it was a double standard, because anyone who was found out to be in the hiring the bravo for whatever were the horrendous acts the bravo was doing, those people were considered clean. There wasn't any consideration that if you were hiring a bravo, that was a mark of stain on you. But people regarded the bravo as someone who was tainted. So another funny hypocrisy that was prevalent in society. And again, with oligarchy, it's very much like how we're defining aristocracy, where you think that you get to rule no matter what, and that you have inherited rights for this, or that you can usurp power. Because obviously being ruled by a grouping of people isn't bad. It depends on, how you situate it. So I fear that this is getting a little bit long, but the main characters from the Bravo, are the Duke and Lord of Sant'Agata, Don Camillo Monforte. So he is the Duke and Lord of Sant'Agata, which I already said, it's in the Naples region. And he is visiting Venice because he has basically a family inheritance that he's trying to claim in Venice, and it's being withheld. And he knows that part of the reason why it's being withheld to him is because he has connections with the Vatican. His uncle is the cardinal secretary. Monforte has a certain protection of the Vatican as well. So Venice, doesn't want to deal with the problems that Monforte is causing them in their typical way of just assassinating him, because they know that there would be a type of reaction by Rome and even Florence to the manhandling a Monforte. Jacopo, I already went through a little bit of his story, and we'll go into more of that later on. Senator Gradenigo, he's one of the members of the Council of Three. He's also the caretaker of Violetta. He was chosen to be the caretaker of Violetta from the state, and she will be in that situation until she's married. And you have Father Anselmo, the priest of Sant'Agata, who's stationed in Venice at the time. He acts in many ways throughout the story as a witness for God in the so-called Christian Republic, where morality is constantly being violated. And you have Antonio, a fisherman from the lagunas, and Violetta, who's the love interest of Monforte. Somehow he saves her when she's in the situation in Florence. Her uncle gets into some kind of calamity, and Montforté saves her. So they've met before, and she already has feelings towards him. They both like each other. She's the daughter of the famed deceased senator of Tiepolo, who is one of the few, it seems, honorable men of Venice. And likely this family has been slowly being killed off because Violetta is the last of her house. So this honorable family is basically was killed off in terms of all of its male members, likely. So this very quickly, the core of the story, Antonio, which you see here on the boat, and this is Father Anselmo with his arms raised. Antonio is a fisherman, and he's the fishermen were like of the poorest class, you could say, in Venice. And Antonio has fought in the wars of Venice. He sacrificed a lot. He's lost his own son to these wars, and he adopted a boy at a very young age from one of his fisherman friend who died in one of the wars as well. So he adopted this boy. He raised him as his own. He's 14 years old, and the state takes this boy to work in the galleys of the ships, which if anyone's familiar with the life of someone who works in the galleys, it's usually something you would, give to a slave or a criminal. It's one of the worst environments, it's said, to be in. And they sent this 14-year-old boy there. And Antonio is pleading with the state to release this boy back to his custody, and at least wait until this boy is an adult before they subject him to something that will be a very trying, influence on him. Basically, Antonio knows that this is going to corrupt the boy, that the boy is too young and pure right now to be in such an environment. And other than that, Antonio is not an unhappy person. He's not thinking to overthrow this system that is very unjust and unfair. He's not unhappy over his situation of poverty or the humility of his station. He's content enough with these things. It's really just when the boy is taken that he says he can't suffer that level of injustice. And so Jacopo's father actually was a friend of Antonio, and they fought in the war together and everything as well. And Antonio really looks at Jacopo as like a fallen man, fallen from grace, that he sells his services to commit murder and so forth for money. But in Jacopo's state, in Antonio's state, Jacopo is the only one really to offer support to Antonio. And one of the ways he does this is there's this very big race event in Venice with these types of boats with the gondoliers that row when they're standing up, and it's considered very prestigious. And Antonio enters the race because he knows that if he wins, or even gets a certain kind of position in the race, he can have a private appearance in front of the Doge. So Jacopo, who's like considered the best oarsman of all of Venice, does it in such a way where he helps Antonio to win the race. So Antonio gets gold and Jacopo gets silver. And Antonio uses this, in front of a whole, like all of Venice pretty much is like watching this race. And Antonio has his moment in front of the Doge, and the Doge wants to award him, this gold ore necklace. And Antonio's like, I don't want that. And the Doge is like, you're right, we'll exchange it for money. And Antonio's like, I don't want the money either. And Antonio always makes it that he never accepts, these types of charities. And he says, I wish you could do me a favor other than these things, which is to free the 14-year-old boy. So this causes a bit of a stir. And this is the thing about Venice, is that when you usurp power unjustly, you are the most paranoid of losing such a power, because there's a certain awareness that it could all fall apart at any moment if it's exposed for the real corruption and violation of power that it is. And so Antonio is that kind of simple disruptor, simple but pure. And again, he doesn't want anarchy, he doesn't want power, influence, he doesn't even want revenge. He just wants them to take back an action that they've already done. But Venice never does that. And Venice never admits that it's at fault. So, you know, the people of Venice at first, they're cursing and they're despising Antonio when he enters the race because of just how he looks. He's a poor man, and they're offended by just this look of poverty. So it already tells you the kind of society that this is, where they don't blame the arbitrators of the injustice in such a society. They blame the victims. But once Antonio wins the race, there's still, you know, enough of a capability. Everybody's moved by, you know, noble and truly noble and great acts. And so Antonio earns the respect of a lot of the Venetians once he does this. So he already has a great voice with the fishermen. Now he's gaining a voice with the general Venetian public. And so the council is starting to get very concerned about Antonio, but they obviously can't do anything too clearly as an assassination, because it would reflect very badly on them. So in this scene, you know, Jacopo was just before visiting Antonio. You know, Antonio has he's later on asked to speak in front of the Council of Three, and Jacopo is also by his side in this and helping to instruct him. So, you know, it strikes us as funny, like, why is this cold-blooded killer so interested in this man all of a sudden that he never had any relationship to, and is moved by you know, the case that Antonio is putting forward. And right before this scene, Jacopo comes up, you know, alongside the boat, and he says, you know, I have food and I have drink for you, because Antonio, because he hasn't been working that day, he has nothing to eat. He's that poor that he lives, you know, day to day with what he fishes. And Antonio refuses them from Jacopo because he thinks that they were bought with blood money. And Jacopo is very hurt by this, and he says, well, have no concern then that they were not bought by with blood money. And Antonio doesn't believe him, and he rather would starve. The next scene is that you have Priest Anselmo, which he's also part of the being the caretaker grouping of Violetta. He's brought in from the state, the police, you can say, the Venetian police, to talk to Antonio. And there's a little bit of it seems, a confusion, because the priest thought that he was talking to someone who had committed a crime or whatever. And Antonio says the story and everything. And he basically just hears him out. He blesses him. And once he leaves to get onto the other boat, the police boat, which seems to be a bigger one, is able to pull the ship from underneath Antonio so that he falls into the water and his ship is dragged back to the shore. And Jacopo, he went, you know, further in the distance when the police, you know, had come to talk to Antonio. He's rushing to save Antonio, but Antonio drowns. So his body is found by the fishermen, and it causes quite a stir. They have his dead body, and they're bringing it, you know, to the city and presenting it in front of the Doge. And they know that it was the state who killed him, but typical to a mob rule, they lose this opportunity. Very much the death of Antonio was is similar to the death of Lucretia, in the sense that it causes this like huge stir from the population of Venice, and they're just, it's like the last, the last straw that people just break under the, mountain of injustice that just constantly is occurring in the system. However, in this case, it's a mob that doesn't have a leader, and it ultimately doesn't have the level of understanding to withstand the sophistry that the state thus responds to it. So quickly, the mob, which is more concerned not with like a qualitative change, but for revenge, is easily tricked by the state into thinking that it was Jacopo who actually killed Antonio, even though they knew it was very unlikely from the very beginning. And they allowed themselves to be swayed by the state in this. And, the fact that the state killed Antonio shows the kind of weakness that the state has, that they couldn't suffer to have an Antonio speaking his mind constantly, because that would have caused too many cracks in their system, that it was that fragile at that point, that the system could no longer defend itself and justify itself with an Antonio walking around with just a very pure way of demanding for justice. But that purity was actually, the most important thing. So the Council of Three, they end up, this is just a slide which I'm going to skip, but it's basically just talking about how the nobles that are also born into the system. So the people that are not nobles are not taught hardly anything, right? So most of them don't know how to read. Like Jacopo doesn't know how to read. Antonio doesn't know how to read. So they don't have any education except for their life experience. And in the case of the nobility, Cooper is just talking about how their education has become very corrupted to its core, so that these people who are born actually not bad people are just constantly becoming corrupted by their entourage. And it's thought that it's a necessity to do this. And that's the real tragedy of the system, along with a people, a citizenry that also are become convinced that such an unnatural twisting of moral education is a necessary thing for the state. So we get to a point where everybody, Jacopo has been like walking around as a public bravo for 3 years, and it's gotten to a point where everybody is like calling for his head. And it's become convenient at this point for the state as well to call for Jacopo's head, which they, were conveniently ignoring for 3 years. And everyone was a little bit confused as to why they were ignoring it. And they offer 300 sequins for whoever captures Jacopo. So Jacopo's is arrested, and we should know that his father, who was friends with Antonio the fisherman, has actually been in prison for all of these years. So everybody thought he was dead. Antonio also thought that Jacopo's father was dead, when in fact he was imprisoned. The state claims that he went missing. And he was imprisoned on false charges of stealing funds. And so in this scene, Jacopo is confessing to the priest Anselmo in his prison cell. And they finally, they realize, they're told for the first time what is Jacopo's actual story. So Jacopo says, I have told you, Father Anselmo, that a false accusation of having wronged the customs brought my unhappy parent under the Senate's displeasure, and that he was many years an innocent inhabitant of one of these accursed cells, while we believed him in exile among the islands. At length we succeeded in getting such proof before the council as ought to have satisfied the patricians of their own injustice. I am afraid that when men pretend that the chosen of the earth exercise authority, they are not ready to admit their errors, for it would be proof against the merit of their system. And the priest responds, and did they refuse to repair these injustices? Because Jacopo and his sister and his mother, they all present evidence to the court of why the father is innocent of these crimes. And Jacopo answers, they could not repair the justice, Father Anselmo, without publishing their fallibility, the fact that they can make mistakes. The credit of certain great patricians was concerned, and I fear there is a morality in these councils which separates the deed of the man from those of the senators, putting policy before justice. The priest answers, this may be true, son, for when a community is grounded on false principles, its interest must, of necessity, be maintained by sophisms. Jacopo continues, after years of prayers and interest, I was, under a solemn oath of secrecy, admitted to my father's prison cell. There was happiness in being able to administer to his wants, in hearing his voice, in kneeling for his blessing. I knew not there the council's motive, when they believed that I was sufficiently caught in their toils, or I was led into that fatal error which has destroyed my hopes and brought me to this condition. So he was allowed access. He thought his father was in exile. Then the state allows him access to see his father in prison. He doesn't know why. The priest answers, thou hast affirmed thy innocence, my son. And Jacopo says, innocent of shedding blood. So we find out that Jacopo is in fact not an assassin. Innocent of shedding blood, father, but not of lending myself to their artifices. I will not weary you, holy monk, with the history of the means by which they worked upon my nature. I was sworn to serve the state as its secret agent for a certain time. The reward was to be my father's freedom. Had they taken me in the world and in my senses, their arts would not have triumphed, but a daily witness of the suffering of my father had given me life, and who was now all that was left to me in the world. They were too strong for my weaknesses. They whispered to me racks and wheels, and I was shown paintings of dying martyrs. Racks and wheels are forms of torture, that I might understand the agony they could inflict upon my father. So they threatened that they would torture his father as well if he didn't become the secret agent of the state. Assassinations were frequent and called for the care of the police. In short, Father Anselmo, I consented to let them circulate such tales as might draw the eye of the public on me. I need not add that he who lends himself to his own infamy will soon attain his object. So basically, all of the corruptions, the worst types of crimes that were happening in Venice, Jacopo agreed that this gossip would be to blame him for all of those problems, which the state would then manipulate the emotions of the people towards that, and where they could concentrate their hate, right, on this object that isn't actually the source of like where all of this is coming from. And that Jacopo agreed to do this because they promised that they would free his father. The priest asks, with what end was this miserable falsehood invented? Jacopo answers, I was applied to as a public bravo, an assassin who walks on the streets, which normally that never happens. I understand thee, Jacopo. I have heard that Venice did not hesitate to use the ardent and the brave in this manner. Father, it is, and more, I had other duties connected with the interest of the Republic, And of course I was practiced in their discharge. The citizens marveled that one like me should go at large, while the vindictive and revengeful took the circumstance as a proof of address. When rumor grew too strong for appearances, the three took measures to direct it to other things. So when people got too upset and, wanted Jacopo's head, the Council of Three would direct their anger to other things. When the anger grew too faint for their wishes, it was fanned, to blame Jacopo for all of these things. In short, for 3 long and bitter years did I pass the life of the damned, sustained only by the hope of liberating my father and shared by the love of this innocent, which is Jessamina, the daughter of the prison keeper. She's really the one who handles the keys in the prison and who has been by Jacopo's side all of these years in his visits to his father. We quit thee, the priest said, but be of heart, son. I cannot think that even Venice will be deaf to a tale like thine. Trust first to thy God and believe that neither this faithful girl nor I will abandon thee without an effort. So the next day, right? So Jacopo is scheduled to be executed the next day. And, the priest was there to hear his last confession. And Jessamine is there because she holds the keys to the prison. She's a very young girl of about like 15 or so, very innocent. And so the priest and Jessamina, they go to the Doge that evening to plead for Jacopo's case. The Doge didn't actually know anything about this. And you see after they've told the story and they're leaving the room that, we as the audience can see the Doge turning to his handler, pleading with his handler, can we please intervene for the sake of Jacopo? Even the Doge is moved by this story and doesn't want Jacopo to be killed. But of course, it's not up to the Doge what happens. So the next day, Jacopo is on the executioner stage. His head is on the chopping block, but Jessamina and the priests are still optimistic that there's going to be an intervention last minute to spare Jacopo's life. And Jessamina makes a very beautiful speech to the mob that's also, waiting to see the monster Jacopo be killed so that everything will become rosy apparently after that, and their lives will be fantastic in Venice. And so she does this beautiful speech, and Father Anselmo thinks that he sees the Doge from his window making a sign to spare Jacopo's life. And Jessamina, in her glee, she turns around to see this and she's greeted with Jacopo's head rolling down the stairs. So he's been killed. The mob is satisfied with this, totally apathetic to the pleas of the priest and Jessamina, and everybody goes about their way. And Cooper ends the Bravo with these lines where he says, the porticos became brilliant with lamps, the gay laughed, the reckless trifled, the masker pursued his hidden purpose, the cantatrice and the grotesque acted their parts, and the million existed in that vacant enjoyment which distinguishes the pleasures of the thoughtless and the idle. Each lived for himself, while the state of Venice held its vicious sway, corrupting alike the ruler and the ruled by its mockery of those sacred principles which are alone founded in truth and natural justice. So Cooper makes a very big point that it's not just the failure of the leaders of the Venetian society, the oligarchy, but it's the failure from the people themselves, who also defend and justify such a system. And it was the people as well who probably were aware on some level that Jacopo couldn't have possibly have been responsible for all of the injustice of Venice, but everyone was willing to put the blame on Jacopo and have him die for their crimes. So again, to make that point, nations and cultures are destroyed not ultimately by evil leaders, but by wrong or false beliefs, adopted as popular opinion by that nation's population. Should such false beliefs hold sway, it will lead to the collapse of that entire society. So this concept of liberty, this concept of responsibility had become warped at a certain point. And this secrecy as well, which is part of this like really corruptful idea of liberty, that you should have such liberty that your identity should even be secret for the actions that you commit, so you can have the most freedom possible. It's the ultimate corrupter, and the people also celebrated that. And so it was for that reason that such a system, you know, was able to continue for as long as it did. People were willing to submit themselves to such a thing. And, you know, I would think that we see a lot of similarities with some of the societies we see today, and how they choose to allow themselves to be governed. Right, this ending part as well. This is the very last part. Thus men too much practice in the interests of life, constantly over, no, that's not the ending. Or maybe it is. Thus, men too much practice in the interests of life constantly overreach themselves when brought in contact with the simple and intelligent. And the experience of every day proves that as there is no fame permanent which is not founded on virtue, so there's no policy secure which is not bottomed on the good of the whole. Vulgar minds may control the concerns of a community so long as they are limited to vulgar views. But woe to the people who confide on great emergencies in any but the honest, the noble, the wise, and the philanthropic. For there is no security for success when the meanly artful control the occasional and providential events which regenerate a nation. More than half the misery which defeated as well as disgraced civilization proceeds from neglecting to use those great men that are always created by great occasions. So that's the ultimate failing of a society, is in times of emergency to not even have the capability to recognize the qualities of the most honest, the most noble, the most wise, that the understanding, the education, the simple morality has become so corrupted that the people are completely blind to recognizing those qualities. That was not actually the ending of the Bravo, but that's an important part. Whew, okay, we're near the end. There's only like maybe about 10 more minutes. So let's just push through a little bit longer. Does someone want to read this paragraph?
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
During the 1840s, as the oligarchy of Europe pushed forward its attempt to split the United States between North and South, Cooper and others of the Cincinnati Society Network began building a new Republican political movement. The millions of German immigrants who had come to America after 1815 became one of the driving elements of this new movement, contributing an infusion of Republican spirit and culture, helping to revive the great ideas of 1776. This movement, which was to found the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln in 1856, used the dying Whig Party in 1852 to run General Winfield Scott for president. Scott was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, the hero of the War of 1812, and commander of the U.S. Army for 30 years. During 1850 and 1851, Cooper, Scott, and Cooper's old friend, Commodore William Shubrick, planned out Scott's campaign. Cooper's unfortunate death in 1851 put Scott's campaign in the hands of Cooper's enemies, ensuring that Scott would lose the election. Yet Cooper's work in helping to build the new Republican movement in the United States resulted 8 years later in the victory of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln crushed the oligarchy-run insurrection of the southern states and launched the American Industrial Revolution, ensuring the survival of the United States as, in the words of Lafayette, the temple of liberty and beacon of hope for all mankind. From Patrick Rucker, The Fight for the Republic, James Fenimore Cooper and the Society of the Cincinnati.
So Lincoln would say these words, which I think are very much, again, at the core of this lecture and Cooper's life's mission. He said this in a debate with the slave powers champion Stephen Douglas, that is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other, the divine right of kings. And again, recall the words of Ben Franklin, a republic if you can keep it. So this question of upholding the moral condition of the society is at the very core of what allows a republic to really function at its best. And this right of sovereignty means that the people must uphold it to a certain degree. But it's also the form of education that we have, such that we can choose the best with the most clear vision, I guess you could say. The best can be naturally selected upon in our society, and we recognize them for their qualities. So I would say the biggest, victory that Cooper helped to form with the Lincoln success was the Centennial Exhibition, which was opened on May 10th, 1876 in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And there was over 10 million people who came from around the world to this exhibit from 37 participating countries to share in certain breakthroughs that were happening in the Industrial Revolution. And again, it was meant to organize for proper republicanism and against, forms of empire and monarchy, wrong kind of oligarchy. So the parting thoughts, and thank you all for your patience. I want to end with Schiller's, just a few words from Schiller's essay, Theater Considered as a Moral Institution, which I think is going to be a beautiful way to end this class. Did you want to read, Jerry?
Yes, I can do it. Such a person lets all previous generations pass in review, weighing nation against nation, century against century, and finds how slavishly the great majority of the people are ever languishing in the chains of prejudice and opinion, which eternally foil their strivings for happiness. He finds that the pure radiance of truth illumines only a few isolated minds who probably had to purchase that small gain at the cost of a lifetime's labors. By what means, then, can the wise legislature induce the entire nation to share in his benefits? For, judging from its consequences, no subject has greater importance for the future of the republic than education. And yet, no area has been more neglected, and none so completely abandoned to the individual citizen's illusions and caprice. The stage alone would be able to confront him with touching, soul-stirring scenes depicting the unfortunate victims of neglected education. False notions can lead even the finest heart astray. And what a disaster when these begin to boast a method and systematically spoil the tender stripling within the walls of philanthropic institutes and academic hothouses. The stage is the institution wherein instruction and pleasure, exertion and repose, culture and amusement are wed, where no one power of the soul need strain against the others, and no pleasure is enjoyed at the expense of the whole. When grief gnaws at our heart, when melancholy poisons our solitary hours, when we are revolted by the world and its affairs, when 1,000 troubles weigh upon our souls, and our sensibilities are about to be snuffed out underneath our professional burdens, then the theater takes us in. And within its imaginary world, we dream the real one away. We are given back to ourselves. Our sensibilities are reawakened. Salutary emotions agitate our slumbering nature and set our hearts pulsating with greater vigor.
And just to quickly add to this, what he's saying is that the world that we live in is an imperfect world, but the world that we envision is always going to be more perfect, right, than what we can execute in reality. And sometimes we can be really bogged down by all of the imperfections that have built up in the society that we are born into or we find ourselves within. But it is through drama that we are freed from those types of shackles. We are brought back to ourselves, where our natural, desire to avoid injustice, to not see injustice succeed, is reawoken in us. And these are good things, especially for our youth, to have these reinstilled, such that we can have change that is more akin to such ideals.
And then at last, O nature, what a triumph for you. Nature, so frequently trodden to the ground, so frequently risen from its ashes. When man at last, in all districts and regions and classes, with all his chains of fad and fashion cast away, and every bond of destiny rent asunder, when man becomes his brother's brother, with a single all-embracing sympathy, resolved once again into a single species, forgetting himself and the world, and reproaching his own heavenly origin. Each takes joy in others' delights, which then, magnified in beauty and strength, are reflected back to him from 100 eyes. And now his bosom has room for a single sentiment, and this is to be truly human.
Right. And I think I will end it there and just open it for discussion, because I know that I went through so much, and I hope that it wasn't an overload. I might have been a little bit too ambitious with all of the different storylines I wanted to go into, but thank you for being my guinea pigs.
No, that was great. That was really good and very comprehensive. Yeah, I put out the statement that we have about 30 minutes. I think we still do. If people have any thoughts or questions, there's a lot to process there. Now would be the time to launch a thought or a question at Cynthia. So we'll leave the stage open there.